Good morning, everybody. This is just a quick video to go over the 1.6.1 review in Apex. I do encourage you to go ahead and do the 1.6.1 review in Apex because there are some interactive questions and features that won't be in this video, obviously, but that are helpful. Okay, so we're just going to look over a few of the concepts that you've covered over this period, 1865 to 1900, with industrialization and culture change that was taking place in the United States. Okay, so some of the causes and effects of early westward migration. And one of the cultural factors that played a role in motivating early westward expansion was manifest destiny. And remember, that is the concept that Americans had a divine right, like a right from God to settle all of North America. Then there was the Homestead Act of 1862, and it made settling the Great Plains almost irresistible to Americans because it offered settlers parcels of land that were practically free. But there were hardships that went along with this that made life for early settlers difficult. One is that the plains were very dry and windy, which made farming extremely difficult. So the Homestead Act only provided 160 acres of land per family, so few people were able to produce enough food to sustain themselves. And speculators also lied to settlers to convince them to purchase land that was extremely poor for farming. Westward migration contributed to ethnic diversity in the Great Plains. You had immigrants and African Americans that made up a large percentage of the settlers in the West. And immigrants often headed west to join communities with others of their own nationality, while African Americans, you remember, hoped to escape racial persecution in the South by embarking on what was known as a Great Exodus to Kansas. Remember, those African Americans were known as the Exodusters. So how did westward expansion change America? So westward expansion happened over the course of several decades, and it resulted in Americans establishing communities from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the U.S. government promoted westward expansion during the mid-late to 19th century by passing the Homestead Act again to entice farmers to come and relocate to these arid, not very fertile necessarily western territories. And they also subsidized railroad construction so that western settlements would be connected with the rest of the U.S. economy. Racial tensions and discrimination affected the lives of Native Americans and Chinese immigrants during westward expansion. Remember that discrimination towards Chinese laborers resulted in laws that stopped Chinese immigration. This was the 1882 act that was passed that completely stopped Chinese immigration and denied citizenship to the Chinese people. And then the effects of westward expansion were even worse for Native Americans, whose societies were devastated by the destruction of the buffalo herds on which they relied and the seizure of their land by settlers. And the Transcontinental Railroad changed patterns of settlement in the American West by making western settlements more viable. Pre-railroad, like before the railroad, ranchers and other settlers had very few markets for the goods that they produced. And they also had to pay huge sums of money to secure tools and lumber. So the transcontinental railroads reduced the cost of transporting both people and resources, which greatly encouraged settlement in the West. Okay, and then just a quick review of some of the changes for Native Americans that happened during this time. So the Dawes Severalty Act attempted to destroy Native Americans' tribal society by dividing reservation into plots of land that Native American families would farm individually. And when violence against Native Americans didn't work, whites tried to assemble Native Americans by coercing Native parents to send their children to boarding schools where they would be taught white manners and values. Westward migration of white settlers, remember, was greatly increased when the National Railroad was completed. So when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, migration exploded, right? That westward migration exploded. If you remember, the ghost dance was a spiritual movement that arose among Western Native Americans, and it was believed that this was going to bring back the buffalo, like it would renew the earth. And although it didn't bring back the buffalo, it did forge a spirit of unified purpose among many Native peoples. And then in response to white violence, warriors from different Native American tribes united to fight victorious battles over white troops, and this culminated with the defeat of General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So a pattern emerged in which whites and Native Americans would sign land treaties that would later be broken by whites when valuable resources were found on the reservation land. Unprovoked massacres of unarmed Native Americans, such as the one that occurred at Sand Creek, were intended to deter Native Americans from attacking white settlers. And corrupt government officials often stole funds intended to support the Native Americans living on these barren reservations, which led to armed uprisings among desperate and starving natives. So how did industrial growth change Americans' lives? So the Union Stockyards was a meat packing district in Chicago for more than a century, starting in 1865. The Union Stockyards were built in response to transportation problems that were caused by the Civil War, when the rivers and the waterways could not be used as freely because of the war. Chicago began to rely on railroads instead of rivers for its main means of transport. The Transcontinental Railroad affected migration patterns in the United States when immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and China migrated to work in the railroad construction. In addition, the railroads opened new areas for settlement, and at the same time, Native American tribes felt new pressures as the population of settlers increased. And then there was the effect of new industrial technology, such as the invention of the Bessemer converter on the steel industry, and this created new job opportunities as industries increased production. So then there were department stores, and department stores affected the lives of Americans in towns and cities by giving people more choices in the goods that they could buy, and in addition, people could buy items with fixed prices, so they had price tags on things now, and they no longer had to bargain for how much they wanted to pay for something. Department stores affected labor opportunities by employing many workers, often women, who usually labored under good conditions and were also given benefits. And then new ways of packaging and marketing goods gave consumers new choices for using their new disposable income. Meeting consumers' needs became an important part of business. And then just a quick overview of industrialization, unions, and big business in the Gilded Age. So some of the issues that U.S. society faced when it came to the question of child labor was the government's problem of regulation. Like, how could legislatures control the corporations' employment of young workers? And could legislators write laws and make them last? Technology changed labor systems in the United States by making it possible to hire more unskilled workers. Technology also created new positions for employment, such as typists or telephone operators, which contributed to an influx of women into the workplace. And then vertical integration contributed to the creation of monopolies by allowing companies to grow by incorporating all of the aspects of production, manufacture, and distribution. And by controlling these costs, companies could crowd out competition, which contributed to the rise of monopolies. The American Federation of Labor, which is one of the early unions, failed to represent all workers in that they only represented skilled workers. And the solution was to create labor unions for both skilled and unskilled workers. Then another union, the Industrial Workers of the World, clashed with government and corporate leaders because IWW members wanted fundamental change in the way America's economic life was organized. They were not pro-capitalism. Many leaders were socialists, which conflicted with the views of corporate leadership. Factors that caused immigration to the United States to increase during the late 19th century. Some of the push factors, remember those factors that push people out of their country? Those were adverse conditions at home like wars, ethnic and religious persecution, or economic hardship. And this drove many Europeans and Asians to flee their homes and come to the United States. The pull factors from the United States were the United States industrial economy, so the job opportunities, and its commitment to religious freedoms. This made it an attractive destination for immigrants. And given the growth rate of the U.S. population at the time, how great a role did labor competition play in management's ability to keep wages low? So a consideration in answering this question is that Henry Clay Frick, for example, was able to break the Homestead strike by bringing in other workers. And immigrants willing to work for low wages often filled the roles of strike breakers. So labor competition does seem to have played a considerable role in management's abilities to keep wages low. So does historical evidence support or contradict the argument that immigrants had a negative effect on U.S. profitability during the Gilded Age? And something to consider is that statistics show that during this period, U.S. productivity grew rapidly. Immigrants were filling the jobs in factories, plants, and railroad yards that was contributing to profitability. And how would you evaluate the claim that immigrants did not adjust well to life in the United States? And something to consider is that evidence shows that immigrants worked at a variety of jobs, managed to live on tight budgets, and participated in politics through union activism. Remember that the name of this era, the Gilded Age, comes from a book written by Mark Twain. And in his book, called The Gilded Age, Mark Twain criticized the culture of greed. So during this period, a few people lived in lavish mansions, but most people lived in much poorer circumstances. Many of them were living in tenements where they lacked basic necessities. Jacob Riis was a social reformer who used flash photography to expose the terrible living conditions in the tenement. And industrialization and corporate practices allowed Gilded Age businessmen to amass fortunes bigger than anyone had previously thought possible. So while a few industrialists became incredibly wealthy, most American families earn less than $1,200 a year. And in 2021 dollars, that's somewhere around $35,000 to $37,000 a year. Gilded Age industrialists were wealthier than previous generations of rich Americans. They had more money to spend, and they lived more lavish lifestyles. They also donated more money to philanthropic causes than anyone had previously in history. Gilded Age philanthropy helped shape American culture because the philanthropists created many American museums, universities, concert halls, and parks. Gilded Age philanthropy made it possible for more Americans to have access to cultural institutions than ever before. And then you'll remember Andrew Carnegie. Remember, he was one of the either captains of industry or robber barons, depending on how you interpret his legacy. And understanding a historian's perspective can help you analyze his or her historical interpretation of history. The historical thinking skill of interpretation involves analyzing diverse historical interpretations. So, for example, there are different ways to look at Andrew Carnegie. Right? He was an immigrant and a self-made man who made his fortune in the steel industry. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth, in which he outlined his philosophy about philanthropy and stated that the wealthy had a responsibility to help those trying to help themselves. But the Homestead strike showed that Carnegie was willing to break the steel union in order to increase his profits. So he was willing to have unfair working conditions in order for his company to increase its profits. And continuing with ideas, beliefs, and culture in the Gilded Age, why didn't Andrew Carnegie simply give his wealth to the needy? For one thing, Carnegie didn't think doing so, just giving money to the needy, would be very beneficial to the poor in the longer term. And he also believed the country would be better off by helping poor people who wanted to help themselves. When you think about the hundreds of millions of dollars that philanthropists like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers gave away, why is the era derisively referred to as the Gilded Age? Well, something to consider is that while some industrialists were very generous with their fortunes, most wealthy people lived incredibly lavish lifestyles, while many people lived below the poverty line. And you might remember Louis Comfort Tiffany was an American artist and designer who worked in the decorative arts, and he's best known for his work in stained glass. Tiffany is known for hiring women. He did not personally design every object in his studios, and many of his artists were women. At a time when women rarely worked outside the home, it was common to see craftswomen working in Tiffany's studio. So did Louis Comfort Tiffany exploit his anonymous female workers, or was he giving them an unusual opportunity? One thing to consider is that Tiffany didn't exploit his female workers any more than he exploited his male workers. All Tiffany artisans lived with the benefits and drawbacks of working in a creative field where credit was seldom given to the craftspeople. And then maybe Tiffany may have hired women because he feared men were going to demand more money. And then the artistic styles of artists like Thomas Eakins, Winslow Homer, and Robert Henri reflected changing cultural values because many of these artist paintings were based on direct observation of active subjects. This style reflected America's growing interest in the outdoors and in what were considered manly pursuits. And then adapting to urban life living in the United States. So how was the experience of immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century different from that of earlier immigrants, and why were their differences significant? Well, immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries arrived in the United States after a period of industrialization, so they had access to factory jobs, but industrialization also produced serious problems, such as pollution and dangerous working conditions. And immigrants were forced to adapt to these issues immediately after they arrived. In order to adjust to the many threats posed by life in an urban setting, immigrants formed tightly knit communities and mutual benefit societies, which were kind of like insurance societies, to ensure that they could survive periods of unemployment or sudden illness. And how did the rapid rate of U.S. urbanization affect life for poor immigrants living in early 20th century American cities? So the speed of urbanization, or how quickly these cities grew, put a massive strain on cities that were unprepared. Populations increased faster than cities could accommodate them, resulting in overpopulation, and with overpopulation came unsanitary living conditions and the rapid spread of disease. And what factors shaped the political landscape of the Gilded Age? So some of those factors, the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, are very evenly matched during the 1880s because after Reconstruction, national politics settled back into the sectional pattern that existed before the Civil War. So Republicans had a firm base of support in the North and West, and Democrats dominated the South. Some negative consequences of this, because the two parties were evenly matched, there was a stalemate, a political stalemate that prevented either party from advancing a legislative agenda to address the nation's problems or chart a new course into the next century. There was an abuse of political power during the Gilded Age. Remember, many politicians were working closely with unscrupulous business leaders, and they directed government funds to companies that simply kept the money without completing any projects. The companies then returned the favor by providing politicians with their political support. And how did populism affect national politics in the 1890s? So support for the People's Party, or the Populist Party, had its origins in farmers' grievances with railroads. And for one thing, the railroads were charging a lot of money to the farmers for transporting their crops. And after the populist movement's political successes, they had some political successes in the 1880s and 1890s, the People's Party was absorbed by the Democratic Party, and those successes resulted in a political realignment that brought Democrats more support in the West and created a new sectional divide in politics. Okay, and we'll stop here and let me know if you have any questions. Have a great rest of the day.